Hello, everyone. You're listening to the Paradigm Shifts podcast with your host, Keisha Kruger. I'm an organization development practitioner and executive coach, working with leaders to create positive changes in the workplace using behavioral science. My personal mission? Share science-based tools and leadership insights from the field that you can use in the workplace and beyond. Considering we spend about 3/4 of our lifetime at work, there is incredible science and organizational psychology that could be used to rethink the way we work, lead, and ultimately live. Join me as I speak with thought leaders and business leaders in practice, unpacking light bulb moments for paradigm shifts. Hello, everyone. On this week's episode, we sit down with a compensation expert, Chad Atwell, who is the principal compensation advisor with Lattice. He leads their compensation practice within Lattice Advisory Services, and his extensive experience in total rewards as a practitioner, technologist, and consultant, he's able to help Lattice customers design and deliver sustainable reward strategies for their changing workforce. He's advised organizations across a wide variety of sizes, industries, and geographies. Chad is a frequent teacher and speaker on total reward topics, including touchpoints with future of work, performance, competencies and skills, and technology. For more information about how to get connected to Chad, make sure you check out the show notes. Hi, Chad. How are you?
Hi, I'm good. How are you?
Great. I am so excited that you're here. Love to talk about compensation. I know we're kind of in a little bit of an uncertain time in our economy right now. What I really want to talk to you about is around philosophy with compensation. And I'm seeing a lot of research and survey results surfacing right now, and I'm sure you are too. And what I'm seeing is that there's the importance of smart compensation strategies for improving employee engagement and retention is kind of like the prominent theme, right? And that's kind of making organizations rethink, how do we design our comp strategies and our comp philosophies, and how do we communicate it at the end of the day to our employees? So wanted to kind of hear from you first. What is a compensation philosophy? And then how do organizations benefit by having them?
Yeah, no, it's a great place to start. Lots of different things that I'm sure we'll talk about through the course of this conversation, but pretty much all of it does come back to, have you started with a solid compensation philosophy, and has that really been communicated out to your employees? Are you taking a real people-centered or a people-centric approach to pay around that? And the start of any human capital experience, regardless of whether we're talking about compensation or learning or performance, any of those things, you want to be able to set expectations correctly. And so that's really what a comp philosophy does. I think of it really more as being your set of compensation principles. Sometimes that has a little bit more teeth to it. Philosophy seems kind of way off for a lot of people. So comp principles are essentially, what are the things that you are intending to do around compensation in your organization? How do you intend to make decisions, and who's going to be involved in that? What sort of data do you use? So the idea is that every organization needs to have these principles, and they mostly serve a couple of purposes. One is to set those expectations. So once an employee joins the organization, they've gone through this process of their offer, and they made certain decisions with certain assumptions around what they were going to receive, and so you want to be able to live up to those expectations around those things. And then kind of the second purpose is just reflecting out to the market. Obviously, we're trying to attract people into our organizations, and so what's going to be different about what you offer, not just from a compensation perspective, but overall sort of total rewards, and how do you focus on that? So those philosophies are really meant to position yourself and almost create like your own brand around compensation and the way that's delivered in the organization.
So there's two benefits to an organization. It helps them set expectations for those employees so they know up front. And then it also helps us attract more talent as an organization.
Yeah,
Is that what I
hopefully
heard?
it helps us attract the right talent.
The
It's going
right
to
talent.
put the expectations in the place where the employees really understand that this is what's offered. And lots of organizations have come out and said, look, we don't pretend to compete with the highest levels of compensation out there. We don't compete with the biggest tech companies out there, that sort of thing. And so you have to be joining the company under the right set of expectations around that.
Yeah, and that's such a great point. But before you can do that, you have to have a comp philosophy or a set of comp principles that you're communicating. I had asked a couple of my colleagues, what are you hearing around compensation from an employee's perspective? And the reaction that I got from that question was employees sometimes, or individual contributors a lot of times as well, in more specific, don't necessarily have an understanding of all that goes into putting together compensation principles or philosophy, like what the market survey salaries and how those are incorporated, and how competitive an employer is trying to be, and also maybe they don't understand what compensation, like total benefit packages are, if an employer is packaging it together, like the total comp together in terms of like bonus and equity and things like that. And so it seems to me that if an employer is having a lot of misunderstanding with their employees around compensation, they've got to set themselves up for success by putting together some set of principles, right?
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, actually, so World at Work is an organization that is very highly regarded in the space for compensation and benefits practitioners. They did some research earlier this year where, you know, pointed to a lot fewer organizations having actual written comp philosophies. So less than 50% of organizations
Wow.
are actually putting together real written philosophies around that. And more than 10% of the respondents admitted to just having no philosophy whatsoever. The big
Wow.
thing that really came out of that was that there was a clear gap between even just having a statement and making sure that the employees knew where to find it or even how to understand it. So there is a lot of education that kind of goes around that, making sure that employees understand what are the different components around that philosophy. I tend to center on a few sort of critical things. Historically, if you were to look at any careers page and any sort of compensation philosophy statement that might be out there, you're going to see two sort of main topics, right? One is competitiveness with the market. The other one is going to be an overall sense of pay for performance. We reward high performance or something along those lines. And those have really just kind of become automatic. Everybody has that now. And so it really does require the total rewards teams or the compensation leaders in the organizations to become more differentiating in their statements and what they include. So the third part, which is really critical now, is expressing your intent around transparency
Mm.
and equity around pay. If you don't include that as part of it, it comes off as being very sort of tone deaf, and you're just really not understanding the criticality of including that as part of your philosophy.
What
And
does
then
it
there,
mean to be sorry to cut you off. What does it mean to
yeah,
be transparent about pay though, from an employee's perspective? Do I just know where I sit relative to the market, or is that relative to my peers? Like how transparent do we
yeah.
get?
Yeah, it's a continuum for sure. And
Mm.
so I usually start. Of course, there's regulations, right? So we're looking at regulations here. I'm in Colorado, so we've had pay transparency for almost over a year now. Other states, California, Washington State, now New York City, everybody's putting into these transparency laws, and so you certainly want to know what's the basic level of compliance with that legislation is typically surrounding the salary ranges that are offered for a particular position. California goes as far as to give employees the ability to request their own salary range at any point. And so you want to be ready for that. And you have to be able to make sure that you're going to be compliant with that, which also includes just a lot of communication and that sort of thing. And then you get to other organizations that kind of go a little bit more into higher levels of transparency around publishing their entire salary range for everybody within the company to see. Or maybe you have structures where you're identifying particular target rates for particular target jobs, and people know that that's a flat rate, that there's no negotiation. If you want to go into that role, that's the rate that you're going to get. So
Mm.
there's a variety of different things that you can put into it.
Yeah, I'm just thinking now, those three areas that you had mentioned, the competitiveness with the market, the rewarding for high performance, and the transparency. As an organization, that can kind of guide your compensation principles, right? If you can kind of outline how competitive are we, um, how do we reward to performance and link performance, or what does that process look like, and how transparent are we on that continuum? That really does give a lot of insight into how compensation is viewed at the a particular organization.
Yeah, and transparency to me, even before we started talking about pay equity and transparency around publishing salary data, to me, like there was a level of differentiation that companies could make in being very open about the processes that they use around decision making. So you say
Mm,
you reward performance. Well, what does that really mean? So does that employee performance, and how does like company performance factor into that? And there's a
yeah.
variety of different factors that you're going to include as part of your decision making. Maybe managers have 100% discretion over the amount of an increase that someone's going to receive. Or lots of companies, especially in the tech space, have gone more to a formulaic approach where, if you meet these different levels of performance and overall the company performs at X level, then that means an X level of percent increase or bonus for everybody in the company. So there's definitely a transparency factor around just the process that's involved with it too.
Yeah, and I just want to go back to the performance linking to pay. There's different schools of thoughts around how we can link performance to compensation or to pay. What are your thoughts around that?
We actually just published our latest State of the People strategy research, and we have a lot of research in this space around pay for performance. I mentioned before, it is kind of like an automatic thing. A lot of people say it, but I think the one thing that's really changed over the course of the last 5 to 10 years is that slowly organizations sort of moved away from performance ratings, right? You wanted to have
Mhm.
more of an emphasis on the conversation and sort of this continuous feedback and everything. And I worked with a lot of compensation people at the time who basically said, look, nobody asked us if you could get rid of performance ratings because that was really critical to the way that we decided what compensation people were going to receive. And so
Mm,
that caused a lot of issues for a while. And what do we actually link compensation to if we don't have a formal performance rating?
right.
I saw situations where ratings became a little bit more like you had like phantom ratings and shadow ratings, things that existed in the background only from a process perspective, which of course is not being very transparent at all. So I think what I recommend now is that organizations really try to push for what's critical from a performance perspective for both the employees and the companies. There's development performance targets and things that people want to achieve for their own personal career growth, those sorts of things. And that can definitely be structured around development initiatives and other things. And then there's the real results, right? So we think about like OKRs. That last R is results. And if you're potentially looking at performance for results, that can be used in a way around, say, like goal attainment or other factors. If you're achieving 100% or 110% of your goals overall, that can be used to help with some of the calculation around a compensation strategy.
Yeah, I think that it's important to have these discussions because I do see more and more research or at least articles that are going out and it's saying, oh, you get rid of the traditional performance reviews, remove them from the organization. It doesn't promote or foster a continuous feedback type of or a continuous performance management type of process.
Right.
But I would argue you need both, right? Like you can do both. We don't have to have one or the other. You can
Yeah,
still have that continuous feedback process and also have some objective performance criteria that links to our ability to pay for performance, because that big question at the heart of it is how else do we pay if we don't have anything to link it to, right?
that's right. Yeah, and even just that research that I mentioned before, 83% recognize that there is an importance. These are typically HR professionals who are really like, in order to make these processes work, we want to be able to have that linkage. And so, vast majority of HR respondents in this survey said that that link is really important. We also found that just 65% of employees in general ranked that performance should be one of the primary factors in
Right.
deciding compensation. So I think it makes sense to employees. What it comes down to is just what are you using, and ratings. They're just so easy to to put all of your money on one thing, one rating. If you're looking at something a little bit broader around goal achievement, you're looking at overall, not just the fact that you've achieved goals, but how did you achieve those goals? Are you sort of reflecting the values and different things within the
Mm.
company? All of that can be used from a performance perspective to help justify some of those compensation changes.
Yeah, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the factor compensation plays in employee retention. And yeah, I've heard before, maybe you've heard this as well. Compensation isn't the only priority in an employee's decision on whether they stay. Sure, I agree with that. Um, there are all those other things at play. Culture, do we have healthy management and leadership at the company? Do we have autonomy or decision making in my role? Those kind of things really do play an important role. But how critical is compensation from your point of view, from what you've seen?
There again, it's sort of like different schools of thought. Some people will call compensation essentially like the like your HVAC at home. A lot of us are working from home, and we're figuring out, is it too hot? Is it too cold? What do I do to kind of optimize my work
Mm,
environment? Companies have been doing this for years, and a lot of people think of compensation as that, like, you don't want to obviously be too uncomfortable. You don't want to cause people to leave the organization because you're not paying enough. You also don't want to go overboard, right? You want to get that just right mentality, and being able to do it that way. I saw a study that came out from Mercer just recently talking about sort of like, it was called the Inside Employees' Minds report. And this is where I think it really does make really drastic level of importance, is depending on the culture and sort of what's happening in the economy. And coming out of the pandemic, if you were to look at where employees' heads were at last year, a lot of them were very focused on physical health, well-being, workload, other things that were really kind of weighing on them on day in and day out. This latest study, those two or three factors have kind of been knocked down by just being able to cover monthly expenses and being able to potentially retire on time. And so
mm.
we've seen employees now change drastically coming out of the pandemic to be much more focused on, how am I making enough, not just now, but potentially in the future, where I'm thinking about my 401k and my ability to retire as well. So it does go back and forth a little bit, but those are things that I think any company can study their own employees around that.
Yeah.
I say that there's a lot of great employee preference studies that you can do out there. And if you're not actively listening to your employees, you're missing a big part of the conversation if you're just looking at the market data.
Yeah, and if you have a really cool software tool like Lattice, I'm plugging you guys in a little bit here because our firm uses you as well, and then you can really study your employee population, and I think that the value there is, especially as we're talking about those results you were just mentioning, is that everybody is at a different stage of their life and their career, right? We have different stages of our careers. Maybe I'm early, just starting my career. I can, my compensation factors, those things driving my retention decisions are going to be different than someone who is maybe ready for retirement or towards the end of their career continuum or career stage.
Yeah, you're picking up on one really sort of key word that's come up recently, just in the last few years, around compensation, and that's segmentation. It's being able to look at your
Mm,
employee population. A lot of us are familiar with companies that, they spread compensation around like peanut butter, and everybody's eligible for the same programs. And you just picked up on, especially young workers coming into the workforce, they have completely different needs than someone like myself, or someone who's been working for 10, 20, 30 years. Just the variety of different programs and things that you need to offer in order to meet people where they're at, make sure that they're taken care of, given their own personal the expenses that they have, and other things that, their budgets. And we've seen trends over time where, of course, for a while, broad-based stock options was really important to a lot of companies. They wanted to make sure everybody had ownership in the company. And then what they realized is that most employees never held on to the stock. They would always sell it as soon as it vested. And so there's a
mm.
lot of like, how do we make these decisions around where people are at, what they value, what they don't value, and offer the right level or the right combination of rewards and compensation for them specifically?
Yeah, and it has to be tailored, right? You can't, not every company's comp strategy is going to look the same. I mean, what are your recommendations for companies that are maybe under 300 employees or around that number below, who are like maybe struggling with limited resources? They want to attract talent, but they also don't have necessarily the resources to expend on, okay, like you can't give out, shareholder or stocks or anything like that for the company. It has to be very limited or tailored to that organization. What are your recommendations for that?
Yeah, I think early stage companies, it's so important to really sort of build that level of, it kind of goes back to just the way that you define the work that people are doing. So obviously, smaller companies, you have some broader roles. And oftentimes, the way people are rewarded is the ability to kind of look and see different parts of the business and sort of grow and develop over time. So even if you're not necessarily doing formal sort of like promotions and that sort of thing, you're giving people opportunities to experience new things that they haven't done. And compensation, of course, very heavily jobs focused, but the way you design those jobs has a really big impact on the way people move within the organization and are rewarded for different experiences that they have. Ultimately, people want to get to higher levels of either technical abilities or leadership abilities. Those are all things that you can do in both small and large companies. Typically, you're identifying competencies and skills and some other things that can be done around that. Doesn't have anything to do necessarily with the dollar signs that people are seeing at that point. It's just giving them the opportunity. Of course, you want to be able to back it up at some point, right, with greater opportunities. So even if you're still pre-IPO and you're just kind of giving out options, you're making that appropriate for the level of contributions that people are giving to the business that way.
That's huge. Thank you. I know we talked a lot about some of the key shifts, but if you could give like top three key shifts that you're noticing around compensation, what would that be for you?
Oh, yeah. Well, we've talked about transparency. I think that's definitely the biggest one.
Mm,
Again, kind of in that state of people strategy research that we found that over half of companies right now, only HR and finance have access to the salary range information. So it really is, it's a huge change. The thing that I found from that research that was really striking was that only about 25% of employees really know the band for their specific level. So people are completely flying in the dark around this, and
yeah.
so we've seen it. Luckily here in Colorado, we've had over a year now of being able to really sort of see the experience of employees come into an organization and know what their expectations are around that.
And what you find online isn't always reliable, right? Like you can, as an individual, go and Google like what's my salary range for this and try to compare it, but it's not always accurate.
That's right. Yeah. And
Okay.
that's, it kind of leads into another big change in this space is that the variety and availability of data is just so different. I've worked with different larger consulting companies in my past, and some of those had their own salary survey houses and everything. And that used to be the only source that companies had for a lot of this data. And that's changing dramatically based on all of this new data around postings and being able to find compensation data and offer data. I really think that's going to be such a huge change for people in this space around compensation and rewards, is that the variety and the kind of the tools that they're going to need to collect and really disseminate all this information, what's good data, what's not good data, those are all things that they're going to be dealing with for the next few years, trying to really dial it in and figure out specifically, as part of like our comp philosophy, if you're targeting the right level of competitors, the right mix of peer companies that you want to compete against in this space, you have much more data available to you in order to do that, but it's not as easy to get to. It's not just one published survey, right, that you're going to
Hmm.
purchase off the shelf from somebody.
Yeah, so you want it makes it more difficult because you don't want just one source, right? You want to have an aggregate view of what's out in the market. So transparency as it relates to that lattice, and sorry, I keep plugging lattice in here, but I'm really excited about compensation. You guys have
Yeah.
launched and released a new tool around compensation. Can you talk to me a little bit about that or share a
Yeah.
little bit about that with those who are listening?
Yeah, it was a huge decision factor for me in joining Lattice. I've really, I've always sort of worked within this intersection of both compensation design and delivery. I think the delivery of compensation in organizations is so important, and technology has just become an absolute critical
Mm.
point for that. And so being able to really drive technology around the decisions that are being made, and really focus on the managers as much as we talk about sort of employees and wanting to provide them that great experience. Managers oftentimes just don't have the right level of information that they need. They don't know how one other manager in a different department is deciding around the same kind of factors. And so being able to provide kind of a common platform for managers and HR users to really kind of moderate the decisions around compensation, it's going to be huge in the future. And being able to link that not just to the performance information, which is what Lattice provides already. Compensation is already kind of pre-integrated with a lot of that performance information, but then being able to bring in other potential like benchmark data, other factors that need to be included as part of those decisions.
Yeah, and just take the monotony out of the process, right? And also get out of those spreadsheets. Spreadsheet fatigue, it's a big thing. Talk to me a little bit about delivery of compensation. I'm curious where you've landed with that.
Yeah. I mean, it goes into a lot of things, and I'm not the first person to say this, but a lot of people have sort of talked about compensation as a conversation that happens with employees, and so that delivery is really about communication, the way that we set those expectations originally about either creating a brand or some sort of comp philosophy statement that you're using to set those expectations, to the way that managers and everyone else that you interact with at a company talks about
Mm.
compensation and the way those decisions are being made. That has to have a very intentional track around the decisions, the criteria that's being used, the timing of it. It's another really big advantage of the technology in this space is that compensation cycles don't necessarily just have to be a once a year sort of a thing. You can now do multiple cycles throughout a year for different purposes. I know companies that will break things up throughout the year and they'll do promotions at one point to really sort of isolate the conversations around that particular sort of compensation change, as opposed to like your big annual comp cycle where you're sort of doing everything from salaries to bonuses and stock. It really does create I think, a better, fuller conversation around compensation, and essentially provides employees multiple opportunities to also provide feedback and complete that feedback loop, whether you're doing surveys or you're just collecting feedback as you're going through those different cycles. It's really important for companies to understand what are the employees experiencing, what are they actually seeing, and do they view that the company is actually living up to their expectations around that.
There's so much that goes into this, and I just think about how where where the challenge typically is at is like with that one-on-one relationship with your manager, and the manager's not being tooled with the right information, as you had said. So then them not being educated, and maybe a company puts out their comp principles, they have that set at the top, maybe the initial onset for employees who are onboarded. But what do those conversations look like with when you're sitting down at your one-on-ones, whether those are monthly, biweekly, or if you're doing like a continuous feedback session or just the end of your appraisals, like that's happening
Mhm.
with your manager, and it's happening with your colleagues too, but it's more intimately happening with your manager when you're talking about what does my career progression look like at the company. It's an intimate conversation. Our manager's skilled to have those conversations,
Right.
you know.
Yeah. And it really starts from the top of the organization too. So I think about lots of CEOs and CFOs, heads of people, CPOs, lots of people in the space, executives who have never talked about compensation during a town hall before. It's like that's the one thing that we never talk about in front of all of our employees, right? And that time is just that it's running out. Like if you're an executive and you haven't really had that honest level of conversation around what compensation looks like at your organization. How do we make decisions around this? How do we think about not just company performance, but individual employee performance? All of those things can be modeled from the top of the organization down, and actually hopefully provide managers a little bit more comfort to be able to have those conversations one-on-one like you were talking about.
I love that. Yeah, it can be completely taboo to have those conversations
Okay.
at like a town hall, but
Right.
you're right. Like that now's the time to be. So if you're a company or an organization, you're listening to this and you want to have a competitive advantage, get in front of the conversations as it relates to compensation.
Right.
I have one final question for you, Chad. Are you ready?
Sure.
I ask
Oh
all
yeah.
my guests this question. What is your most recent paradigm shift? It could be related to the work that you're doing or anything else.
Yeah, it's a great question. I've been at this for a while. I think what I would highlight is really just what I've seen over the last couple of years, and I'm going to talk about maybe what people think is a little bit of a boring topic, but it's job architecture. It really does come back to the way that you've structured work within your business. And I've worked with more than a couple of organizations now where, for context, like job architecture used to be the job of the compensation team. They were the ones who really sort of owned everything from the way the levels were set up, the way that you compared that information out to market, and it was used mostly for the benchmarking piece of it. But now organizations have really discovered, one, if we don't have good job architecture, we can't really compare compensation well across the different roles within our business. So equity can be very hard to demonstrate if you don't have good comparable job data. If you haven't set levels within your business correctly and that sort of thing, you're going to have a hard time just demonstrating that level of equity around compensation. But beyond that, organizations are really tackling things like development opportunities. So levels within your organization will then be tied potentially to competencies and skills and other things that really help provide employees not just the vertical sort of ladder of how they move up within the organization, but potentially how they move across the organization and look at like potentially different opportunities that are outside of like a very narrow idea of a career structure that they have for themselves. So that to me has been such a huge explosion of growth and looking at different people, not just heads of compensation, but heads of like organizational development and CHROs and people who lead talent within the business to become very focused on. We need to have a great job architecture that really reflects what we value within our business and the way that we want people to be able to move within the talent processes.
You're speaking my language. As a director of organization development, this is something that we're extremely focused on in our the organization I'm working for. So just transforming this entire process and really getting to the meaning behind the job architecture. And I love the idea of that it's not like a traditional career ladder anymore. It's a career lattice. So I want to thank you so much for that insight, for your paradigm shift being shared, and then for all the other insights that you brought to us today. Thank you.
Thank you. Really appreciate the time and the opportunity.
Thank you so much for tuning into this week's episode. If you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to leave a review, rate, and subscribe wherever you're listening. If you know a business leader in practice or friend who you think would be interested in this episode, please consider sharing it with them. I am so grateful for your support. For more updates, you can follow us at Paradigm Shifts Podcast on Instagram. See you on the next episode.